They laughed loud enough for the whole street to hear. That was the part Mabel Hartley would never forget. Not the words, not the way Warren Delby's lip curled when he looked her over from boots to bonnet, but the sound. That particular kind of laughter, the kind that didn't bother to be quiet about itself, the kind that meant the people doing it didn't think you were worth the effort of cruelty. Just amusement. Just a woman standing in the dirt outside the Red Hollow General Store while a man she'd never met decided out loud that she wasn't worth his time, his name, or the air it would take to finish the sentence. "I'd sooner marry my barn door," Warren said, and his friends went sideways with it. Mabel didn't cry. She was 26 years old and she had stopped crying over men like Warren Delby somewhere around the fourth rejection, which meant she'd had two more after that to practice keeping her face still. She was good at it by now. She stood there and let him finish, and then she picked up her flour sack and walked home. But the town didn't let it go. The town never let anything go. If you want to find out what happened next, how a woman rejected 7 times walked into the most powerful ranch in the territory and changed everything, don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Red Hollow was the kind of place that had opinions about everything and facts about nothing. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines, close enough to the river to survive a dry year, but far enough from the railroad that everything arrived late. Supplies, news, and new ideas most of all. The people there weren't bad, exactly, but they'd been looking at the same faces for so long that they'd decided they already knew everything worth knowing about each person in it. And what they'd decided about Mabel Hartley was that she was a tragedy. She was large. That was the word they used when they were being polite, which wasn't often. Her mother had been a round woman, and her grandmother before that. And whatever inheritance had come down through the women of that family, Mabel had received it in full. She was not the kind of large that people looked past. She was the kind that made men step back and reconsider everything they thought they wanted, even when what they wanted was simply a capable woman to help them run a piece of land. She had tried 7 times to be that woman. The first had been Daniel Pryor, a widower with 3 children and a wheat farm that needed more hands. He'd written to the matchmaker in Billings, and so had she, and when she arrived at his door, he stood in the frame for a long moment without speaking. "I appreciate you making the trip," he said, and she knew before he finished the sentence what the rest of it would be. She'd made the trip home in the rain. The second and third she didn't think about much anymore. The fourth had been the worst. A man named George Cutter, who'd actually sat with her for an hour over coffee, who'd laughed at something she said about the spring floods, who'd looked at her like maybe he was changing his mind, and then stood up and said he didn't think it would work out, and left 2 coins on the table for the coffee like she was someone he'd hired. After 7, the matchmaker in Billings stopped sending letters. Mabel lived with her aunt on the eastern edge of town, in a house that had been her parents' before the fever took them both in the same winter, 4 years apart. Her aunt, Clara Briggs, was a thin, quick-talking woman who loved Mabel in the distracted way of someone who had their own grief to manage. They got along. Clara didn't say much about the rejections, which was about the best you could ask for from family. What Clara did say, one evening when the lamp was low and the cicadas were going strong outside, was this: "You know more about those animals than half the men in this county." She meant it as comfort, but it was also simply true. Mabel had grown up watching her father work cattle. She'd followed him before she was tall enough to see over the fence rails, and she'd listened to everything. The way he read the sky for weather, the way he tracked grass conditions across a grazing range, the signs in a horse's gait that told you something was wrong before the animal showed it any other way. Her father had talked to her like she was a ranch hand because she was, even at 8 years old. He hadn't had sons, he'd had Mabel, and he'd made do. And somewhere along the way, making do had turned into something else. She could calculate how many head of cattle a section of land could sustain through a dry summer. She knew the water table behavior in this particular valley, knew which wells ran deep enough to hold through August and which ones would give out by July. She understood cattle illness in a practical way that most ranchers spent decades learning and still got wrong. She'd read every agricultural pamphlet she could get her hands on. borrowed books from the circuit preacher's collection, and she kept a notebook, worn at the corners, the ink faded in places, where she'd recorded her observations about this land for the better part of 8 years. None of that was visible to the men who looked at her and saw only her size. She'd understood that for a long time. It didn't make it easier exactly, but it made it clearer. The problem was not something she could fix by working harder or knowing more. The problem was that people in Red Hollow saw what they expected to see, and they expected her to be nothing much. She had started to wonder in the quiet hours if they were right. Not about the knowledge. She knew what she knew, and she didn't have the arrogance to dismiss it, but about the rest of it, about whether any of it would ever matter to anyone, whether knowing how to read a grazing range was worth anything if no one ever gave you land to graze. She was thinking about that the morning she heard about the Voss Ranch. It wasn't gossip, exactly. It was louder than gossip. It was the kind of talk that moved through a town in one day and arrived everywhere at once. Colton Voss, who owned more land in the valley than the next 3 ranchers combined, was looking for help. Not ranch hands. He had those. Something else. Someone who could look at what was happening to his range and figure out why the grass was failing 2 months before it should, why the creek that fed his eastern pasture was running low when the snowmelt should still be coming down from the peaks. Mabel heard it at the dry goods counter, from the woman in front of her who was telling it to the man beside the flour barrels, and she stood there with her list in her hand and felt something move in her chest that she hadn't felt in a while, something uncomfortable and too large for the space it was trying to occupy. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about all the reasons not to go. She'd been to enough front doors. She knew what happened at front doors. And Colton Voss wasn't a widower with 3 children and a wheat farm. He was the most powerful man in the territory, a man who'd built his operation from 40 acres into something that employed 30 men and ran cattle across 5,000 acres of range. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, and had a reputation for being direct to the point of rudeness with people who wasted his time. She would go to that door, and he would look at her, and it would be the same as every other door. On the 4th morning, she picked up her notebook and walked to the Voss Ranch. She told herself she was going because of the water problem, not because of anything else. She told herself she'd read enough about this valley's hydrology to know what was probably happening to his eastern creek, and that information was worth offering whether he took it or threw her off his property. She told herself she was done waiting for opportunities to arrive in a shape that was comfortable. She was also terrified. She walked the 4 miles to the ranch road at a pace that was slightly too fast, and by the time the main house came into view, she was sweating through her collar and her legs felt unsteady. She slowed down. She made herself breathe. The yard was busy. 2 men were working near the barn, another was crossing from the bunkhouse toward the main gate, and a 4th was doing something to a fence post near the water trough. Nobody paid her much attention until she got close to the porch, and then one of the men near the barn stopped what he was doing and watched her. "Help you?" he called. "I'm looking for Mr. Voss." The man looked at the other man. Something passed between them. Not a word, just a look. And Mabel had been receiving that look her entire adult life and knew exactly what it contained. "He's out on the range." "I'll wait." Another pause. "Could be a while." "That's all right," Mabel said. She sat down on the wooden bench near the porch steps, set her notebook on her knee, and waited. It was a warm morning and getting warmer. She could hear cattle somewhere to the north, the distant sound of a horse being worked in a pen she couldn't see. She opened the notebook and looked at the pages she'd marked that morning. The sections about creek flow and valley systems. The notes she'd made 2 summers ago about the way this particular watershed behaved in low rainfall years. She was still reading when the sound of hooves came up the main road, and she looked up to see Colton Voss ride into the yard. He was exactly what she'd expected physically. Broad, sun-darkened, the kind of man who moved through the world like he expected it to get out of his way, and was usually right. He swung off his horse and handed the reins to one of the hands without looking, his eyes already on her. She stood up. He walked toward her and stopped about 6 feet away and looked at her with the kind of frank assessment that most men tried to disguise, and Colton Voss apparently didn't bother. "You're here about the water problem," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think I know what's causing it," Mabel said. He tilted his head. "Most people who come out here to tell me what's causing it don't actually know. They've got theories that don't account for the specific watershed, or they haven't looked at the elevation data, or they're recommending solutions that work in a different type of terrain. I know, Mabel said. I've read their recommendations. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, nothing that obvious, but a slight change in the angle of his attention. All right, he said. Come inside and tell me what you think. She followed him in. The front room was functional and spare. A table, chairs, a map pinned to the wall that showed the ranch boundaries. He sat down and gestured at the opposite chair, and she sat and opened her notebook and began. She told him what she believed was happening to his creek. The snowmelt from the northern ridge was being diverted by ground settlement upstream. Not a dramatic shift, but a slow one. The kind that happened over years and looked like drought until you went up and looked at the topography and realized the water was finding a different path. She told him the grass failure in his eastern pasture was consistent with reduced subsurface moisture, not surface drought. A distinction that mattered because the solution was different. She told him she could show him on the map where she thought the diversion was occurring. He listened. He didn't interrupt, which she hadn't expected. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both aimed at the parts of her theory that were inferential rather than observed. She answered them honestly, including the parts she wasn't certain about. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. How long have you been watching this valley? He asked. 8 years. I started keeping records when I was 18. Your father ranched here? He did. He passed when I was 22. Colton looked at the map on the wall, then back at her. I have had 3 men come out and look at this problem. All 3 gave me solutions that would cost me money I don't want to spend on problems that wouldn't actually fix what's happening. He paused. What you're describing is different. It's what the evidence suggests, Mabel said. If you're right, he said, then the fix is less expensive than what I've been told. And faster. Yes. He sat back. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way the men in town looked at her, not the particular measuring silence she'd spent her life receiving. It was different in a way she couldn't entirely name, like he was actually trying to figure something out rather than confirm something he'd already decided. What are you looking for? He asked. Coming here. It was a direct question, and she gave him a direct answer. Work. Real work, not domestic work. Something that uses what I know. He nodded slowly. I'll ride up to the ridge with you tomorrow, he said. You show me what you're talking about. If it holds up on the ground, we'll talk about what that looks like. She walked home that afternoon with her notebook under her arm and the evening light coming in long and gold across the valley, and she didn't let herself feel too much of anything because she'd been to enough doors. But something was moving in her chest again, that uncomfortable too large feeling, and she didn't entirely manage to push it down. The next morning she was back at the Voss Ranch before 7. He was already up, 2 horses saddled, coffee made, and waiting on the table. He poured her a cup without asking and handed it across, and she took it, and they drank in silence for a moment before he said, You know the North Ridge? I've walked it a dozen times. Then you lead, he said. She led. It took 3 hours to get up to the point she'd identified from her calculations. A natural shelf in the terrain where the spring runoff would logically divert if the ground had shifted. She was aware of him behind her the whole time, watching the terrain, watching her, occasionally asking questions that told her he understood the landscape deeply, even if he hadn't connected these particular dots yet. When they reached the shelf, she got down from her horse and walked to the edge of the formation and pointed. The evidence was clear once you knew what to look for. The ground was wet where it shouldn't be, the vegetation pattern was wrong, and the creek bed below showed the markers of reduced flow on one side and unexplained saturation on the other. Colton stood beside her and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Damn, he finally said. Yes, Mabel said. So the fix is upstream, not down. The fix is here. You redirect the flow back into its original channel. It's not simple work, but it's contained. He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his expression she didn't entirely know how to read. Not attraction. She wasn't going there in her mind. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. How did 3 men with more resources than you miss this? He asked. Mabel considered the question seriously. They came with solutions they already believed in, she said. I came with questions. The ride back down was quieter. She wasn't sure what he was thinking, and she didn't try to fill the silence with talk. When they reached the yard and handed off the horses, he stood for a moment looking at the eastern range. "The town is going to have things to say," he said, "about me bringing a woman out here in any kind of professional capacity." "The town always has things to say," Mabel said. "It doesn't usually make them right." He looked at her, and for the first time in that interaction, she saw something close to amusement cross his face. Brief, but there. "No," he said. "It doesn't." What happened next? What Colton Voss said to her that afternoon in the yard, what deal he offered, and what she answered, would begin a chapter in Mabel Hartley's life that Red Hollow hadn't seen coming and would spend a long time trying to process. The town had made up its mind about her years ago. It was about to find out that minds, like creek beds, could be redirected. Mabel walked back to the bunkhouse office that Colton had unlocked and handed her the key to, and she set her notebook down on the desk, and she sat in the chair and she looked at the map of the ranch pinned to the wall above it. She had been rejected 7 times. She had never, not once, been wrong about the land. She opened to a fresh page and picked up her pencil, and she began to write. The key sat on the desk in front of her for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening, and Mabel kept glancing at it the way you glance at something you're not entirely sure is real. It was a small key, iron, nothing special. But it unlocked the bunkhouse office that Colton Voss had handed over to her use without ceremony or lengthy explanation, and that made it the most significant object she'd held in recent memory. She didn't go home that night. She stayed at the desk until the lamp oil ran low, working through the ranch maps, cross-referencing what she'd seen on the ridge with the elevation records Colton kept in a wooden box on the shelf. Meticulous records, she had to admit, better than she'd expected from a man running an operation this size largely on instinct and reputation. She found 3 more anomalies before midnight. 2 were minor. 1 was not. In the morning, she was at the main house before Colton finished his coffee, and she spread her notes on his table without preamble. "There's a second problem," she said. "Your south grazing section. The grass density maps from the last 3 years show a pattern of decline that doesn't match the rainfall data. Something else is happening there." He looked at her notes. He looked at the maps. He asked the same kind of precise questions he'd asked the day before. Pointed, stripped of any attempt to seem more knowledgeable than he was, which she found unusual in men who ran things the way he did. "What do you think is causing it?" he asked. "I don't know yet. I'd need to walk the section." He drained his coffee. "After breakfast," he said, and pushed a second cup across the table toward her. It was the most ordinary thing. A cup of coffee pushed across a table. But Mabel sat down and drank it, and nobody made a comment, and the morning went on. They walked the south section that day, and she collected soil samples in small cloth bags she'd brought in her coat pocket, labeling each one with location markers she'd noted on the map. Colton watched her work without interrupting. One of the ranch hands, a lean older man named Pruitt, who had the look of someone who'd been skeptical since birth, trailed behind them at a distance that said he was keeping an eye on things without being asked to. She noticed Pruitt. She didn't address it. On the walk back, Colton said, "Pruitt's been with me 11 years. "I can see that," Mabel said. "He doesn't warm up fast." "Most people who are good at what they do don't." Colton glanced at her. "Is that a comment about yourself or him?" "Both, maybe." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Fair enough." The soil analysis took her 2 days, working in the office with the reference materials she'd brought from her own collection and the ones she borrowed from the ranch's small shelf of agricultural texts. What she found was not what she'd expected. The soil wasn't depleted. It was contaminated. Not severely, not in a way that would kill cattle outright, but enough to suppress grass growth over time. The mineral composition was off in a way that suggested something foreign had been introduced to the water that fed that section, upstream from the grazing area. She sat with that finding for a full evening before she told Colton, not because she was uncertain about it, because she understood what it meant, and she wanted to be sure before she said it out loud. Someone, at some point, had put something into the water feeding his south pasture. Whether deliberately or through careless runoff from another operation, she couldn't yet say. But the effect was there in the samples, patient and clear and damning. She knocked on the main house door after supper, He answered it himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed there'd be a hand around. "Come in," he said. She spread the samples and her notes on the table and explained what she'd found. She kept her voice level and factual. She laid out what was confirmed, what was probable, and what remained unknown, in that order, without dramatizing any of it. Colton stood very still while she talked. That stillness wasn't peace. It was the kind of controlled quiet that a man arrived at when he was keeping something held in. When she finished, he said, "Deliberate." "I can't confirm deliberate without knowing the source upstream," Mabel said. "It could be runoff from a mining claim, poor waste management from another ranch, or something intentional. The mineral signature is unusual enough that I'd want to trace it." "I know what's upstream from that section," he said. His voice was flat. "Who?" "Frank Aldermore. He runs the Crossbar spread about 2 miles north." Mabel knew the name. Most people in the county did. The Aldermore family had been in the valley nearly as long as anyone, and they'd spent most of that time believing the valley was fundamentally theirs by right of arrival. Frank Aldermore was the third generation of that belief, and he wore it with the particular confidence of a man who'd never been seriously challenged. "You and Aldermore have history?" she asked. "We have the kind of history that men in this territory develop when one of them has more land than the other one thinks is fair." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "He offered to buy my eastern section twice in the last 5 years. I said no both times." Mabel looked at her notes. "If this contamination is deliberate, it's been gradual, at least 2 years of effect, probably 3. That's not an accident, and it's not a single incident." "No," Colton said. "It's not." The room was quiet for a moment. "You need more than my soil samples to act on this," Mabel said. "You need documentation. Someone who can identify the source and connect it to the contamination pattern. If you go at Aldermore on what I've found so far, he'll deny it, and your soil samples from a woman most of the county doesn't know will carry exactly as much weight as he decides to let them carry." Colton looked at her. "You're telling me to wait." "I'm telling you to build a case that can't be dismissed," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She knew, from a lifetime of watching men process difficult information, that the worst thing you could do in that silence was fill it. "All right," he finally said. "What do you need?" What she needed was access to the upstream water sources, which meant mapping the creek system from the point of contamination back to its origins. It meant comparing those findings against anything she could document about the Crossbar operations activities over the past few years. It meant, most practically, riding into territory that bordered Aldermore's land, which was not without its own complications. She spent the following week doing exactly that. Colton assigned her one of the horses, a brown mare named Cass who had a slightly difficult temperament that the hands had been avoiding, which Mabel found she didn't mind. Difficult temperaments she understood. She and the mare came to a working arrangement by the second day, and by the third, Cass was taking direction without argument. Pruitt noticed. She caught him watching one morning from the barn door, his expression unreadable but his attention real. She didn't say anything. She rode out. The creek system was more complex than she'd initially mapped. There were 3 tributary feeds into the main channel that ran past the south pasture, and she needed to sample each one. The first 2 were clear. The third, the one that came down from the northeast, from the direction of the Crossbar spread, was not. She took samples from 4 points along that tributary, moving upstream until she found where the contamination began. The source was a shallow, settling pond on land that, based on her best reading of the survey marks, fell right on the boundary between Voss and Aldermore territory. Maybe just over the line onto Aldermore's side. Maybe not. She documented everything. She drew the survey marks as precisely as she could, noting the reference posts and their conditions. She noted the settling pond's approximate dimensions and the coloration of the water, which had a faint mineral cast to it that matched what she'd found in the south pasture soil. She labeled her samples with coordinates relative to the nearest survey post. On the ride back, she let the mare set the pace and thought about what she had. It was solid, not unassailable. A good lawyer for the other side could find gaps in her survey readings, but it was solid. More importantly, it was documented in a form that could be followed and verified by someone else. She was so deep in thought that she didn't notice the two riders until they were close enough that the mare tossed her head. They came from the northwest, moving at a pace that was not quite casual and not quite aggressive. The particular gait of men who wanted you to know they'd seen you without quite announcing themselves as a threat. One was older, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had made a lot of decisions it wasn't sorry about. The other was younger, maybe 25, with the look of a man who was still learning what his face was supposed to do. "You're on the wrong side of the line," the older one said. Mabel looked around with the careful deliberateness of someone consulting their own notes. "I don't believe I am," she said. "You've been riding along this creek for the better part of 3 hours." "That's right, on Vossland." "Vossland ends at the postmarker you passed 20 minutes back." "I didn't pass a postmarker 20 minutes back," Mabel said. "The nearest postmarker in this section is approximately a quarter-mile north of where I'm currently standing." The older man looked at her with an expression that was recalibrating. He'd expected, she understood, a different kind of interaction. He'd expected her to be uncertain about the survey lines. He'd expected to be able to make her uncertain. "You work for Voss?" he asked. "I do." "Doing what?" "Land management," she said. "Water rights documentation. Survey reference work." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the cloth bags hanging from her saddlebag with a different quality of attention. "Those samples?" "Yes." "You got permission to collect samples from this watershed?" "From the Voss sections, yes. That's where these are from." She held his gaze. "Is there something specific you'd like to discuss, or should I get back to it?" The younger man said something to the older one, too low to hear. The older man didn't respond. He kept looking at Mabel with an expression she recognized. Not quite anger, more like someone mentally filing something for later. "Tell Voss that Frank Aldermore said hello," the older man said. "I'll do that," Mabel said. They rode off north. Mabel watched them go until they were far enough away, then exhaled slowly and told the mare to move. She reported the encounter to Colton that evening, along with everything else. He listened to the whole account, his expression tightening slightly when she described the men. "That was Deke Aldermore," he said, "Frank's older brother. He manages the north section of the crossbar." "He was checking what I was doing," Mabel said, "not randomly. They'd been watching long enough to know I'd been along that creek for hours." "Which means they know someone's looking." "Yes." Colton stood and went to the window. "You have what you need from that section?" "Enough. I want one more round of samples after the next rainfall to compare the upstream readings. Rain will clear some of the surface contamination and tell us what's coming from the ground versus what's been introduced externally." "When's the next rain?" 4 to 6 days, based on how the pressure's been moving." She paused. "I could be off. Weather doesn't cooperate with documentation schedules." He almost smiled at that. "No," he said, "it doesn't." He turned back to the room. He looked like a man carrying more than the immediate problem, which she supposed he was. Running an operation this size meant there were always 12 problems happening simultaneously, and she'd only been looking at 2 of them. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said. She waited. "The cattle loss in the eastern section this month is higher than I reported to the county office." He said it without flinching, but she could see the effort that straightforwardness cost him. "I underreported because I didn't want to signal weakness to the other operations. 3 of my hands are talking about leaving if it doesn't improve before summer, and I have a note coming due in August on the eastern land purchase that I can't make if the herd numbers don't recover." Mabel absorbed this. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the person trying to fix my water problem," he said, "and you ought to know how much time we actually have." She looked at the map on the wall. The eastern section, the south pasture, the creek system, the ridge diversion, all of it connected, all of it under pressure, all of it on a clock she hadn't known about until 30 seconds ago. "August," she said. "August. That's 14 weeks. 13 and a half, he said. "I've been counting." She picked up her notebook. She didn't say anything reassuring because she didn't have anything reassuring to say that was also true, and she'd learned a long time ago that the gap between those 2 things was where trust died. "I'll have the water diversion work mapped and ready for your crew by end of next week," she said. "The south pasture contamination. That's going to take longer to prove to a standard that holds up, but I'll have enough documented by the 4th week to take to the county land office, assuming we decide that's the route. And the cattle recovery? Depends entirely on the water. Fix the water, the grass comes back, the weight improves. That's a 10-week recovery minimum from the point when clean water is restored. She paused. It's tight. Yes. It's possible. Yes, he said again, and this time there was something different in the word. Not hope, exactly. Something more durable than hope. Like a man picking up a tool he knows is going to be heavy. The week that followed was the hardest kind of work. Not dramatic, not visible, just grinding, careful daily effort. Mabel was out before first light most mornings, writing sections she'd already covered to recheck her measurements, collecting the post-rain samples when the weather finally came through on day 5, cross-referencing everything against the county survey records that Colton had sent for from the land office in town. The hands watched her. Most of them watched the way Pruitt did, not hostile exactly, but waiting to see if she was going to ask them to do something they'd have to refuse, or say something that proved what they privately believed, which was that whatever Colton saw in her was probably a mistake that would sort itself out in time. She didn't try to win them. She didn't have the energy for it, and it wasn't her job. She did her work, and she was direct when directness was needed, and she stayed out of matters that weren't hers to get into. What shifted things, unexpectedly, was a horse. There was a gray gelding in the far corral that none of the hands had been able to work with for 3 weeks. He'd come in with a purchased lot from the fall sale, and something about his history, nobody knew what, had made him unmanageable in a way that went beyond ordinary stubbornness. He'd put one man on the ground hard enough to crack 2 ribs. After that, the standing agreement among the hands was that the gray was a problem to be dealt with later. Mabel noticed him on her 3rd day. She noticed the way he moved in the corral, not the unpredictable lunging of a mean animal, but the tight, watchful circling of something that had learned that stillness got punished. She knew that movement. She'd seen it in animals that had been handled badly, not cruelly necessarily, but incorrectly, pushed past their tolerance before they'd found any reason to trust the thing pushing them. She spent 2 evenings just standing at the fence, not trying to interact, just being there, at the same distance, at the same time, doing nothing that required a response from him. On the 3rd evening, Pruitt materialized next to her at the fence without announcement. "Nobody's been able to do anything with that horse," he said. "I know," Mabel said. "I'm not trying to do anything with him yet." Pruitt looked at the gray, then at her. "What are you doing then?" "Letting him decide I'm not a problem." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "Colton paid good money for that animal." "I know that too." Another silence. "You worked horses before." "My father did. I grew up behind him." Pruitt made a sound. Not agreement, not disagreement. He stood there for another few minutes watching the gray, and then he walked away without another word. 4 days later, Mabel led the gray out of the corral on a loose line, walking him in slow circles in the open yard, the animal blowing hard but moving. Pruitt was at the barn door. 3 other hands had found reasons to be nearby. Nobody said anything. The gray kept walking, kept breathing, kept deciding she was not a problem. That evening at supper, she ate at the bunkhouse table with the hands, which had been awkward the first week and was now simply the arrangement. Pruitt passed her the salt without being asked and without comment, which from Pruitt she understood to be roughly equivalent to a formal endorsement. It was not smooth. There were days when the work felt impossible, when the evidence she needed was just beyond what she could confirm, when the sheer weight of what Colton was carrying became visible in his face, and she had to resist the urge to promise him things she wasn't sure of. There were days when the town's voice came back to her in the quiet moments. All 7 front doors, all 7 silences, all the ways she'd been told without words that she didn't quite fit the world she was trying to occupy. She was, she reminded herself, the same person who'd walked across 4 miles of valley to knock on a door she expected to be closed in her face. She was the same person who'd sat on that bench and waited. She could keep being that person. The contamination documentation reached the threshold she needed on the 22nd day. She had 4 sets of samples from the tributary, 2 pre-rain and 2 post-rain, showing consistent mineral contamination that matched a signature she'd identified in agricultural runoff documentation from a mining company that had operated 2 valleys over 6 years ago, the same company that had sold mineral extraction rights to a land parcel that was now part of the Crossbar operation's northern boundary. The Aldermoors hadn't introduced the contamination. They'd inherited it or acquired it. Whether they knew about it and had allowed it to persist, had perhaps even facilitated it, was a different question, one that the soil samples alone couldn't answer. But the documentation she had was enough to bring to the county land office and force an investigation, which would in turn force the question of what the Crossbar operation knew and when. She put the full report together over 2 evenings, writing it out in the clearest language she could manage, organized in the order that a county officer would need to follow it. She included copies of the relevant survey references, the sample labels and their location coordinates, and her analysis of the mineral signature. She brought it to Colton on a Thursday morning. He read it straight through without speaking. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the table for a moment. "This is enough?" he asked. "It's enough to compel an investigation," she said. "It's not a verdict. But an investigation will find what an investigation finds, and what's in that tributary is real. It doesn't go away when someone official looks at it." He nodded slowly. He picked up the report again and looked at the first page. "You wrote this," he said. "Your name's on it." "Yes." "The county land office is going to have questions about who you are and what your qualifications are." "I know." He looked at her. "They may not take this seriously coming from you." "I know that too," Mabel said. "That's why the documentation has to be so thorough that dismissing it would require them to dismiss their own survey records and a mineral analysis that matches established scientific documentation. I've made it harder to ignore than to act on." He held her gaze for a moment. "You've done this before? Built something that hard to ignore?" "No," she said. "But I've spent a long time watching people ignore things they shouldn't, and I paid attention to how the ones that didn't ignore those things were different." Something moved in Colton's expression, subtle but real. He set the report back down. "I'll take this to the land office Monday," he said. "I'd like you to come with me." She hadn't expected that. She kept her face even. "All right. If they have technical questions, I want you to be the one answering them." He paused. "And if they try to dismiss it because of who you are, I want them to have to do that to your face instead of behind a closed door." She understood what he was saying. He was not just bringing her along as a resource. He was putting his name next to hers in a public setting, in the county seat, in a room where people would see it. In Red Hollow, that meant something. She wasn't naive enough to think it meant everything, but it meant something. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. The weekend passed in the way that weekends do when something large is waiting at the other side of them. Slowly, with the particular weight of unspent anticipation. She went over her documentation twice more. She found one small error in her survey reference calculations and corrected it. She rode the south pasture on Saturday morning and noted that the grass at the eastern edge of the contaminated section, now 3 weeks since the water diversion work on the ridge had been completed and the clean flow restored to the eastern pasture, was showing the earliest signs of recovery. Not dramatic, a slight thickening at ground level. Nothing anyone else would notice yet, but she noticed. She wrote it in her notebook with the date. Sunday evening, she sat in the bunkhouse office with the lamp burning and the window dark, and she thought about Monday. She thought about walking into the county land office, which she'd been in twice before, and both times for matters that had nothing to do with her. A deed transfer after her father passed? A boundary question her aunt needed settled. She thought about the men behind those counters and what their faces would do when Colton introduced her. She thought about what she was going to say when they asked about her qualifications, which they would. She had no degree. She had no formal certification. She had 8 years of notebooks, a detailed knowledge of this specific valley's hydrology and soil composition, and a contamination report that was either right or wrong, regardless of who had written it. That was what she had. It would have to be enough. She blew out the lamp and walked to the house she'd been given use of, a small structure near the bunkhouse, 1 room and a porch that had belonged to a former foreman. and she sat on the porch in the dark for a while, listening to the cattle somewhere in the distance and the sound of wind moving through the grass. She was not afraid. She had used up most of her fear on those 7 front doors, and what was left had been spent on the ridge walk and the encounter with Deke Aldermore, and the moment she'd told Colton about the contamination and had to watch his face absorb it. Fear had become less available to her than it used to be, and she wasn't sorry about that. What she felt sitting there in the dark was something she didn't have a clean word for. Not confidence. Confidence was about being certain, and she was not certain. Something more like readiness. The feeling of having done everything that could be done before the thing happened, and arriving at the morning of it with nothing left to second guess. She had walked into this valley's problems with her eyes open and a notebook in her hand, and she had found what was there to be found. Whether that was enough was a question Monday would answer. She went inside and went to sleep. The county land office in Harrow Creek was a 2-story building that smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular kind of authority that comes from being the only place in 100 miles where certain decisions get made official. Mabel had been inside it twice before, and both times had felt the building's indifference to her the moment she crossed the threshold. It was not a hostile place. It was simply a place that had processed thousands of people across its counters and had stopped noticing them individually somewhere around the 2nd decade of operation. She noticed it differently this time. She noticed the placement of the counters, the arrangement of the clerks, the door at the back that led to the senior officer's room. She noticed who looked up when she and Colton came in and who didn't. Most of them looked up. A woman of her size walking in beside the most prominent rancher in the valley was not the standard Monday morning traffic. Colton went directly to the front counter without the hesitation of a man who'd spent time wondering how he'd be received. He had the ease of someone who'd been received well most places he'd walked into, and Mabel watched the clerk's expression shift from neutral to attentive in the space of 2 seconds. "I need to speak with Garrett," Colton said. "I have documentation to file, and I have questions about enforcement procedure." Garrett was the senior land officer, a man in his 50s named Howard Garrett, who had the reputation of being methodical to the point of slowness, but reliable to the point of being immovable once he'd arrived at a conclusion. Colton had told her this on the ride in, and she'd filed it as useful. "He's with someone," the clerk said. "I'll wait," Colton said, and moved to the chairs along the wall. Mabel sat beside him. She set her document case on her knees and kept her hands flat on it. The clerk had looked at her twice, once when she came in, once when she sat down, with an expression that was not quite anything she could name, not contempt, more like the face of someone trying to reconcile 2 things that didn't immediately fit together. They waited 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, 2 other men came in, were attended to, and left. A clerk dropped a stack of files and spent 4 minutes collecting them. A dog wandered in through the open door, was shooed out, and came back in. Mabel watched all of this. Colton sat with his hat on his knee and didn't fidget. When Howard Garrett came out of the back room, he saw Colton first. "Colton, what brings you in?" "Water rights issue. Potential contamination on my south section. I've got documentation." He stood and gestured to Mabel. "This is Mabel Hartley. She's been managing land assessment for my operation, and she put the report together. She can answer technical questions better than I can." Garrett looked at Mabel. He was a man who'd learned to keep his face professionally neutral, and he did it well, but she caught the half-second delay between seeing her and responding, the beat where something processed and rearranged itself. "Miss Hartley," he said, "come on back." Garrett's office had maps on 3 walls and a desk that had clearly been expanded twice as the volume of paperwork in his life grew. He sat behind it, and they took the 2 chairs in front of it, and Mabel opened her document case. "What's the nature of the complaint?" Garrett asked. Mabel handed him the report. "Mineral contamination in a tributary feeding the south grazing section of the Voss operation. I've documented the contamination across 4 sample points with pre- and post-rainfall comparison. The mineral signature is consistent with industrial runoff associated with extraction activity. The source traces upstream to the northern boundary of the crossbar operation." Garrett took the report and began reading it. Not skimming, actually reading, moving through the pages at the pace of someone following an argument rather than looking for a summary. This took several minutes. Mabel let it. Halfway through he stopped and looked up. These survey references, you used the 1887 boundary posts? And cross-referenced against the 1891 resurvey, Mabel said. The post I'm using is the primary coordinate markers confirmed in both. There's a copy of the relevant resurvey page in the back of the report. He found the page, looked at it, went back to reading. When he finished, he set the report down and looked at her with the full attention he'd apparently been reserving. You said you managed land assessment for the Voss operation. How long have you been doing that? 6 weeks formally. I've been tracking this valley's hydrology in a personal capacity for 8 years. What's your formal training? She'd known this was coming. None in the institutional sense. My father ranched in this valley, and I learned alongside him from childhood. I've read extensively in agricultural and geological reference materials, and I've kept documented observations of this specific watershed for 8 years. The report stands on its own sources. The survey references and the sample data can be verified independently of anything I say about myself. Garrett looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Colton. You're standing behind this? I'm standing behind the samples and what they show, Colton said. Mabel identified the problem. I rode out and saw the source location with my own eyes. What's in that tributary is real. Garrett tapped the report with one finger. I'll need to send an inspector out to take independent samples. That's procedure. It'll take 10 days to 2 weeks to schedule. We understand, Mabel said. If the independent samples confirm what you've got here, we have grounds to compel the crossbar to identify the source and cease whatever activity is contributing to it. He paused. That assumes the source is on their land or the result of their operation. If it turns out to be residual contamination from the old mining activity before Aldermore ownership, then the contamination is still in a tributary affecting Voss land, Mabel said, and the question becomes whether the current landowner has an obligation to remediate it. That's a separate legal question, but the contamination itself is documented. Garrett looked at her with something in his expression that was different from the look she'd received at the counter. You've thought about how this resolves, he said. I've thought about the different ways it might resolve and what the documentation needs to establish for each of them, she said. I've tried to write the report so it's useful regardless of which resolution pathway you end up on. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the report again and looked at the first page. I'll get the inspection scheduled. Is the access to the tributary through Voss land? The sample points are accessible from Voss land, yes, Mabel said. I'll provide a written route guide if that's helpful. It would be, he said. They left the office 20 minutes later. On the steps outside, Colton put his hat back on and looked at the street. That went better than I thought, he said. He's a careful man, Mabel said. Careful men respond to careful documentation. He was skeptical of you at the start. Yes. You didn't let it rattle you. I've had practice, she said. It came out more evenly than she'd expected. Colton looked at her sidelong. The 7 rejections. She hadn't known he knew the number specifically. It had been general knowledge in town, but she hadn't told him, and she'd assumed, wrongly apparently, that he hadn't been paying attention to the particular details of her reputation. Among other things, she said. He nodded once and didn't pursue it, which was exactly right. They rode back to the ranch in the late morning light, with the inspection scheduled and the report officially filed and the waiting begun, and Mabel felt the particular quality of exhaustion that came from doing something difficult correctly. Not victory, nothing so clean, just the feeling of having held the line. The inspector arrived 12 days later. His name was Clement, and he was a young man of perhaps 30 who had the efficiency of someone who knew his job and the caution of someone who'd been burned by getting ahead of his conclusions. He collected samples from all 4 points Mabel had documented, plus 2 additional points she suggested, and he asked her several pointed questions about her methodology that she answered without defensiveness. When he left, he said the results would take 3 weeks. 3 weeks was a long time. The August note was still out there, its date not changing. The cattle herd's recovery was proceeding but slowly. The grass in the eastern section was genuinely coming back. The weight gain had begun to show in the monthly measurements. But it was the kind of progress that required patience, and the kind of patience that was harder to sustain when a deadline was counting down in the background. And then, 12 days into the 3-week wait, Colton's south pasture fence went down. Not all of it. A section, maybe 60 yards, that took out one of the main containment lines on the east side. When the hands found it at first light, 15 head had gotten through and were spread across a quarter-mile of open range. It took most of the morning to collect them, and 2 were missing entirely by midday. Mabel went to look at the fence section before the hands began repairing it. She walked the break slowly, looking at the ground, looking at the posts, looking at the wire. Pruitt came up beside her. "Storm could have done it," he said. "There wasn't a storm," Mabel said. "Wind gets strong through that draw." "The posts aren't broken," she said. "Look at the bottoms." She crouched and pointed at the nearest post, which was lying on its side. "If wind takes a post down, you see stress fractures where it snapped. This one's been pulled. The ground around the base is disturbed in a pattern that goes outward, not down." Pruitt crouched beside her and looked. He didn't say anything for a moment. "The wire's been cut in 2 places," Mabel continued, "and then the tension on the remaining wire pulled the posts. You cut the wire first, the posts come easier." She stood. "Someone did this at night, probably 2 people, working from the outside." Pruitt was quiet. She could see him working through it, not doubting her, she thought, but accepting something he didn't want to accept. "Aldermore," he said. "I don't know that," Mabel said, "but someone who knows the inspection results are coming and wants to put pressure on this operation before they do." She told Colton that evening. She told him what she'd seen and what she concluded, with the same discipline she applied to everything. "Here is what is confirmed. Here is what is probable. Here is what I don't know." He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "If I go at Aldermore over this fence," he said, "I look like a man who's grasping. I look like the contamination complaint is just the opening move in a range war and I'm escalating." "Yes," Mabel said, "that's probably the intent." "So I don't go at him. Not publicly, but you document it." She held up her notebook. "I've already written it up. Date, time, description of the damage, my analysis of the cause. You have 2 of your hands sign as witnesses to what the fence looked like when it was found. You put it in a file. A file that does what? A file that becomes part of a pattern if there are more incidents." She paused. "And that can be presented alongside the contamination documentation if this comes to a legal proceeding, to show that the response to the complaint was interference rather than cooperation." He looked at the notebook in her hand. "You think like a lawyer." "I think like someone who spent a lot of time watching people in power dismiss things," she said. "The only defense against that is documentation they can't dismiss." He was quiet again. Then, "The 2 missing head. That's money I don't have right now." "I know." "And the hands who repaired the fence today. They know something's wrong. I can see it in them. If they decide this operation is under serious threat, I'll start losing people before August." Mabel sat with that. It was a real problem, the kind that documentation couldn't solve. The morale of 30 men who'd signed on to work a successful ranch and were starting to wonder if it was still that. "Who's the one they listened to?" she asked. "If you wanted to steady them, who's the person that matters?" He didn't hesitate. "Pruitt." "Then you need Pruitt to believe this is going to hold," she said, "not because you told him, but because he sees why." "And if he doesn't believe it?" "Then you need to find out now rather than in August," she said. It was harder than she meant it to sound, and she softened it. "Pruitt's been here 11 years. He left something somewhere to be here. That doesn't just turn off." Colton looked at her for a moment. "Would you talk to him?" She hadn't expected that either. She thought about Pruitt, the barn door in the evenings, the salt passed without comment, the way he'd watched her with the gray gelding. "I'll talk to him if he comes to me," she said. "I'm not going to go find him and try to persuade him. He's not that kind of man, and it won't work." "No," Colton agreed. "It won't." She left it there, and the next morning she was at the gray gelding's corral before breakfast, doing the work she'd been doing with him. Slow progress, patient, requiring nothing dramatic. And 20 minutes in, Pruitt arrived at the fence. "Lost 2 head yesterday," he said. "Found one of them this morning down by the south draw." "That's good," Mabel said. "Still one missing." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, watching the horse. You think the fence was Aldermore? I think it was someone who knows about the inspection, she said. That might be Aldermore. It might be someone who works for him. It might be someone else with an interest in this situation I don't know about yet. Why haven't you told Colton to go after him? She glanced at Pruitt. Because going after someone without enough to stick them is how you lose. You give them the chance to say you're the aggressor, and you spend your energy defending yourself instead of building the case that actually matters. Pruitt looked at the horse. The gray was standing at the far end of the corral, watching them both. You're patient, he said. It wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite the opposite. I've had to be, she said. He looked at her. The town thinks this is going to fall apart. There's talk. People are saying Colton's made a mistake. The town thought I'd never get past the second week, Mabel said. They're not always wrong about things, but they weren't right about that. Pruitt was quiet for a long time. The gray took 3 steps toward them and stopped. He never did that before, Pruitt said, meaning the horse. He's deciding, Mabel said. He takes a while, but he gets there. Pruitt looked at the horse, then at her. Something in his expression settled. Not dramatically, no speech, no declaration, just the small visible shift of a man who'd arrived at a conclusion he was going to live with. He left without saying anything more, and Mabel turned back to the horse. The inspection results came 17 days after Clement had left, 3 days ahead of schedule. They came in the form of a letter to the county land office addressed to Colton Voss, and Garrett sent a writer out with it rather than waiting for Colton to come in, which told her something about the contents before she opened it. Colton read it first, then he handed it to her. The independent samples confirmed the contamination. The mineral signature matched the reference documentation she'd included in her report. The source was identified as originating from a settling pond that the county survey office placed with the updated boundary markers from the 1891 resurvey on land belonging to the crossbar operation. The letter indicated that Garrett's office was initiating a formal compliance notice to the Aldermore family and requiring a response within 30 days. 30 days. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and looked at the wall. This is it, Colton said. This is the beginning of it, she said. Aldermore has 30 days to respond. He'll get a lawyer. The lawyer will look for gaps in the survey placement and argue the settling pond is boundary ambiguous. That buys time. How much time? Depends on how hard he fights it. A month of response, a month of counter documentation, a hearing. She stopped. It could run past August. The word landed between them with the weight she'd known it would carry. Colton sat down. He picked up the letter again and read it, not as if looking for something different, but as if the act of reading it again would somehow change what it contained. I need the note extended, he said, or I need to find another way to cover it. Who holds the note? Bank and Harrow Creek. Sunderland. She thought. Is there anything on this operation that can be liquidated without damaging the recovery? The Northern Timber section. I've had 2 offers on it in the past year. If you sell it, what do you lose? Nothing I'm using right now. It's been fallow since I bought it. I bought it for expansion, not immediate use. He paused. I'd be selling potential, not active operation. Potential you can rebuild later, she said. The operation itself you can't rebuild if the note comes due, and you can't make it. He looked at her. You're telling me to sell. I'm telling you what the math looks like, she said. Selling the timber section covers the August note without touching the cattle operation or the land you're recovering. It's a loss, but it's a contained loss. He was quiet. It's your decision, she added. I can only tell you what I see. What do you see after August? He asked. If I get through August, if the contamination compliance goes through and the south pasture recovers, what does this operation look like in a year? She thought about that carefully because she didn't want to answer it the way a person answers when they want to give someone hope. She wanted to answer it the way she answered everything. In a year, if the water remediation holds and the grass recovery continues at the rate it's been going, your south section is back to full carrying capacity. Your eastern section is already most of the way there. The contamination complaint, if it resolves in your favor, and the evidence is strong, potentially gives you a legal claim against the crossbar for damages, which is a separate conversation, but not nothing. She paused. It's not a comfortable year, but it's a year that ends in a better position than you're in now. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm going to call you on that in 12 months. All right, she said. He sold the timber section the following week. The buyer was a man from outside the county who'd been interested in it for 2 years, and the price was fair. Colton didn't look happy about it. He signed the papers and came back to the ranch and went out to look at his cattle for a long time, and Mabel gave him the afternoon without any business in it. What happened 3 days after the sale was something none of them had anticipated. Deke Aldermore came to the ranch, not Frank. Deke, the brother Mabel had encountered on the creek, the older one with the face that made a lot of decisions. He came alone, which surprised her, and he asked to speak with Colton, which was expected, and he specifically asked that Mabel be present, which was not. She heard this from the hand who came to get her, and she walked to the main house with a neutrality she had to work to maintain. Deke was sitting in the front room when she got there. He had his hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who'd spent time deciding to do something he didn't entirely want to do. Colton was standing across from him with the stillness she'd come to recognize as his version of very controlled feeling. Deke looked at Mabel when she came in. He didn't look away. The settling pond is ours, he said. Frank knows it. He's known for about 2 years that it was contaminating the downstream sections. He didn't do anything about it because he thought if Colton's south pasture went to hell, he might be able to buy it. He stopped. I didn't know that's what he was thinking until after you filed the complaint. He told me then. The room was very quiet. Why are you here? Colton said. Because I've been on this land for 30 years, Deke said, and I'm not going to watch my brother turn it into something crooked. And because whatever Frank thought he was doing, we're the ones who own that pond, and the county's going to find that out whether I tell you or not. He looked at his hat. I'd rather it come out this way. Mabel looked at Colton. His expression was the one she'd learned to read as him processing something that required more than a moment. What are you offering? He asked. Frank will agree to remediate the pond. Full cooperation with the county inspector. No legal contest of the boundary placement. Deke looked up. In exchange for not pursuing the damage claim. Colton looked at Mabel. She knew what he was asking. She thought about it for a moment. Not the legal dimensions, those were clear enough, but the practical ones. The contamination stopped. The remediation meant the tributary ran clean from this point forward. The absence of a legal fight meant the resolution came in weeks rather than months. And weeks mattered enormously right now. The damage claim, if they pursued it, might yield money, or might drag through a legal process that cost more than it recovered. The remediation has to be verified by an independent inspector, she said, addressing Deke directly. Not county, a private inspector that we select. And it has to be complete before we sign any agreement withdrawing the damage claim. Deke looked at her. You'd be the one selecting the inspector? I'd recommend one for Colton's approval, she said. Someone with documented expertise in water system remediation. We'd need written verification from them that the pond is neutralized and the downstream contamination is cleared. Deke was quiet for a moment. Frank's not going to like the conditions. Frank put contaminated water in my pasture for 2 years, Colton said. He can live with the conditions. Deke nodded once. He stood up and put his hat back on. I'll talk to him. You'll have an answer by end of week. He left. The door closed behind him and the room had a different quality of quiet, the kind that comes after something significant has shifted. Colton turned to Mabel. You think he's straight? I think he came here without Frank knowing, she said, and I think a man who does that has made a decision about which way he's facing. Whether Frank goes along with it is a different question. If Frank refuses, then the county process continues and you have Deke's statement as evidence of Frank's prior knowledge, which strengthens the damage claim considerably. Colton looked at the door. He knows that. Yes, he's not a foolish man. He came here because this was the better outcome for his family, not because he was doing us a favor. She paused. But the better outcome for his family and the better outcome for you are close enough to the same thing right now that it doesn't matter which one he was primarily thinking about. Colton was quiet. Then, the fence, the cattle. She understood what he was asking. That's not in this conversation. That's a separate matter, and I don't know yet whether it connects to Frank or to someone else. I wouldn't include it in a negotiated agreement, and it's too loose. But you think it was him? I think it was someone who knew about the complaint and wanted to put pressure on you before the inspection results came in, she said. That narrows the field. But I can't prove it, and what I can't prove I won't put in writing. He looked at her with an expression she didn't entirely know how to interpret. It wasn't simple, and it had layers she'd need more time than she had right now to separate. You've been here 6 weeks, he said. 7, as of yesterday. In 7 weeks, you've identified 2 major problems with this operation, documented a contamination case that passed independent verification, kept my hands from walking out, and taught a horse that nobody could manage to accept a lead line. He paused. And now you just negotiated a preliminary agreement with a man who came here intending to negotiate. I asked for conditions, Mabel said. That's not the same as negotiating. In my experience, it's exactly the same thing. He shook his head slightly. The town doesn't know what they rejected. She looked at him. She held the words for a moment and felt their weight, and then set them down in the way she'd learned to set down things she couldn't afford to carry right now. The town knows what they saw, she said. It's not their fault that what they saw was incomplete. He looked at her for a long moment. And the 8 years of notebooks? Evidence, she said, that it's possible to know something thoroughly without anyone having asked you to. Outside, the evening was settling over the ranch, and somewhere in the south pasture the grass was growing back one blade at a time, slow and patient and indifferent to the calendar, doing what it had always known how to do as soon as the water running toward it was clean. Frank Aldermore's answer came on Thursday, 2 days before Deke had said it would, which Mabel took as a sign that the conversation between the brothers had not been an easy one and Frank had wanted it over. The answer was no. Not a negotiated no, not a conditional no. A flat refusal delivered through a lawyer in Harrow Creek named Pitts, who sent a letter to Colton's address stating that the Aldermore family contested the boundary placement of the settling pond, contested the methodology of the contamination documentation, and intended to file a formal counter-complaint with the county land office, challenging the inspector's findings on procedural grounds. Colton read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down without expression. Mabel read it after him and set it down the same way. Procedural grounds, Colton said. They're going to argue that Clement's inspection was improperly initiated because my original report was compiled by someone without certified credentials, Mabel said. It won't invalidate the samples. The samples are the samples. But it could slow the process if Garrett has to spend time defending the initiation procedure. How long does that buy them? 6 to 10 weeks, if it works. If it doesn't, less. Garrett will push back and the question will go to the regional land authority. She paused. It's past August either way. Colton was quiet. She could see him doing the arithmetic she'd already done. The note, the timber section sale that had bought time but not solved the underlying pressure. The recovery timeline that was real but not fast enough if the legal resolution stretched into fall. Deke, he said. Deke came without Frank knowing, she said. This is Frank's answer to Deke's visit as much as it is to us. Can we use what Deke told us? Not directly. It was a private conversation, no witnesses, nothing in writing. But what he told us changes how I read the documentation we already have. She picked up her notebook. If Frank has known about the contamination for 2 years and allowed it to continue, that's not negligence. That's a choice. The difference between those two things matters legally, and it's in the samples if you know what you're looking for. She had been looking at it since the previous night. In fact, since the particular quality of Deke's statement had stayed with her through sleep and into the early hours of the morning. 2 years of knowing. The grass failure in the south pasture had begun showing in the records approximately 26 months ago. That was not a coincidence, and she had spent 4 hours assembling the documentation that showed why it wasn't. She spread her notes on the table beside the letter. The contamination didn't start 2 years ago, she said. Based on the sample progression, it's been building for closer to 4 years, but the concentration increased significantly about 26 months ago. That increase corresponds with an expansion of the crossbar's northern operation. I found the county permit filing for that expansion in the land office records when I was pulling the survey documents. She pointed to the relevant page. The expansion increased the volume of material running through the settling pond. Frank didn't create the contamination, but he expanded the operation that intensified it. And if Deke is right that he knew 2 years ago, he knew when he filed that expansion permit what the downstream effect would be. Colton looked at the notes. Can you prove he knew? I can prove the timeline, she said. The expansion, the increase in contamination concentration, the permit that shows he signed off on the capacity increase. I can't put knowledge in his head, but I can put a sequence in front of a regional authority that makes innocent explanation very difficult. Pitts will argue he didn't know what the expansion would do downstream. Pitts can argue whatever he wants, Mabel said. The question is what the evidence suggests to someone looking at it without a stake in the outcome. Colton leaned back in his chair. He looked like a man who was tired in the bone-deep way that came from months of sustained pressure rather than any single hard day. She understood that kind of tired. She'd carried her own version of it for years. What do you need to build this? He said. The permit records are already in the file. I need 3 more things. First, a statement from a qualified agricultural expert confirming that the expansion level output from a settling pond of that type would predictably increase downstream mineral concentration. That establishes the connection between the expansion and the contamination increase. Second, a comparison of the cattle weight records from the south section over the past 4 years showing the decline that corresponds with the contamination timeline. You should have those records. I have them. Third, she said, and this was the harder one, I need to talk to Deke Aldermore again. Not to get him to testify, I don't expect that, but to find out if there's any documentation on the crossbar side, inspection reports, water tests, anything that Frank may have filed or received that would show official awareness of the pond's output. Colton looked at her. You want to go to Deke? Not to the crossbar. Somewhere neutral. She paused. Deke came here because he'd made a decision about which way he was facing. That decision didn't go away because Frank said no. If anything, Frank saying no may have made it harder for Deke to go back. He might refuse to meet. He might. But he came here once without being asked. He's not someone who does things like that without knowing what he's doing. Colton was quiet for a long moment. If Frank finds out Deke talked to us again, that's a problem between Frank and Deke, Mabel said. It's not one we created. He nodded slowly. I'll send him a message, ask him to meet at the Harrow Creek Hotel. Neutral ground, nobody's territory. The message went out that afternoon. The response came back the following morning. Deke would meet Thursday, noon. In the days between, Mabel worked. She pulled the cattle weight records Colton had kept, meticulous, monthly, going back 6 years. And she charted the South pasture numbers against the contamination timeline and the expansion permit date. The correlation was not ambiguous. The decline in average weight gain from cattle grazing the south section began 14 months after the crossbar expansion, which was consistent with a gradual contamination buildup reaching a threshold that affected grass quality, which affected feed value, which showed in weight. She put this in a document with the numbers laid out clearly in a table and the timeline marked against it. She also wrote to the State Agricultural College in the capital, to a professor of land science whose work she'd read in 2 of the reference texts she owned. She wrote a precise, professional letter describing the situation in general terms and asking for a statement on the expected downstream effects of a settling pond expansion of the type and scale documented in the permit filing. She enclosed a copy of the permit's technical specifications and her sample data. She didn't know if he'd respond. She sent it anyway. On Thursday, she and Colton rode to Harrow Creek. Deke was already at the hotel when they arrived, sitting at a corner table in the dining room with a coffee he hadn't touched much of. He looked like a man who'd been having a difficult week, which she supposed was accurate. He looked at Mabel when they sat down. Frank knows I came to you, he said, before either of them spoke. I don't know how, but he knows. What happened? Colton asked. We had a conversation I don't want to describe in detail, Deke said. The short version is that Frank and I are not currently speaking, and I am running the north section of the crossbar on my own for the foreseeable future, which I have the right to do under the family agreement. He looked at his coffee. So if you're worried I'm here to gather information for him, I'm not. I wasn't worried about that, Mabel said. I was wondering whether you had access to any records from the crossbar that might show official documentation of the pond's condition or output. Deke looked at her. You're building the case against him. We're building the case against the contamination, Mabel said. Frank's role in it is what the evidence shows. Deke was quiet. She let him be quiet. She'd learned over these weeks that the most important moments in conversations were often the ones where nothing was said. There was an agricultural inspector who came through the crossbar 2.5 years ago, Deke said finally. Routine visit. He noted the pond in his report, said the capacity had increased, and recommended a downstream impact assessment. He stopped. Frank signed the receipt for that report. I saw it. He told me the inspector didn't know what he was talking about, and he wasn't paying for an assessment on land that was performing fine. Mabel kept her expression neutral. Beside her, she felt Colton go very still. That report would be on file with the county agricultural office, she said. Yes. Would you be willing to state in writing that you saw Frank sign that receipt? Deke looked at her for a long moment. That's not something I can take back once I do it. No, she said. It's not. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She watched him and didn't try to help him decide. This was his to carry, and she understood that. He's my brother, Deke said. I know, Mabel said. I spent 30 years building something alongside him. I know that too. Another silence. The dining room moved around them. A waitress crossing with plates, 2 men near the window talking about cattle prices, the ordinary noise of a working day in a county seat town. He put something poisonous in a man's water and let it sit there for 2 years because he wanted the land, Deke said. Not angry. Something past anger. The flat, exhausted tone of someone who'd already done their grieving. That's not a mistake, that's a decision. Yes, Mabel said. He looked at her. You write it up, and I'll sign it. She wrote it up that afternoon in the hotel, at a small desk in the room Colton had taken for the night, while Colton went to the county agricultural office to request a copy of the inspection report from 2.5 years ago. The request was a matter of public record, and the office produced it within the hour. A 4-page document from an inspector named Waverly, noting the settling pond expansion and recommending a downstream impact assessment, with Frank Aldermore's signature on the receipt page dated 29 months ago. Deke's written statement, when she brought it to him and he read it and signed it, was 1 page. Precise, factual, no elaboration beyond what he'd told them. She'd written it in the plainest language she could find because plain language was harder to argue with. She sat with the signed statement and the inspection report in her hands and felt the weight of what they were together. They rode back to the ranch the following morning. Colton was quiet most of the way, which she'd come to understand meant he was processing something he hadn't finished with yet. About 3 miles from the ranch road, he said, "How does this end for Deke?" She'd been thinking about that. Depends on Frank. If Frank fights and loses, the crossbar takes a financial hit from the remediation costs and whatever damages get assessed. Deke's north section is separate under the family agreement, so he's insulated from the worst of it, but a prolonged legal fight damages the operation overall. She paused. If Frank accepts that he can't win and agrees to remediate, it ends faster and cleaner. That's better for Deke. You think Frank accepts that? I think Frank's lawyer is going to look at the inspection report and Deke's statement and tell him his procedural challenge is no longer viable, Mabel said. And I think a man like Frank Aldermore, when his lawyer tells him something is no longer viable, listens. He's not stupid. He made a calculated decision. When the calculation changes, he'll make a different one. Colton glanced at her. You're not angry at him. She thought about that. I don't have the time for it, she said, and it wouldn't change anything he did. Most people would be angry. Most people didn't spend 8 years keeping notebooks, she said. When you spend that long documenting things patiently, you start to understand that the facts don't care about your feelings. They're just the facts. I can be angry later, when there's time. He looked at her with that expression she still hadn't fully learned to read. What do you do with it, the anger, when it comes? She was quiet for a moment. I write it down, she said. I've got a section in the back of the notebooks that isn't evidence. It's just what happened and how I felt about it. Not for anyone else. Just so it exists somewhere. He nodded. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't either, and they rode the last 3 miles in the comfortable silence of people who had learned each other's weight. The letter from the State Agricultural College came 11 days later. Professor Aldous Mears, who had published more papers on watershed contamination in grazing territories than anyone else whose work Mabel had been able to find, wrote back a 5-paragraph response that was everything she'd hoped for and several things she hadn't known to ask. He confirmed that a settling pond expansion of the scale documented in the permit filing would predictably increase downstream mineral concentration in a ratio he specified, that the timeline she'd described was consistent with a gradual contamination buildup, reaching a threshold of agricultural significance, and, the part she hadn't anticipated, that he had personally reviewed an identical case in a neighboring state 4 years ago and could provide comparative documentation if needed. He also said he'd be willing to provide a formal expert statement if the matter came to a regional authority proceeding. She read the letter 3 times. Then she went to find Colton. He was in the east pasture with Pruitt, looking at the grass recovery, which was now visible enough that you didn't have to know what to look for. The section that had been sparse and yellow-edged in early spring was thick and green in patches, spreading. Not complete, it would take another full season to be fully restored, but unmistakably recovering. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. Pruitt, standing beside him, waited without asking. When Colton finished, he handed the letter to Pruitt. Pruitt read it with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, then handed it back to Mabel. "Professor from the State College," Pruitt said. "Yes." "Willing to testify?" "Willing to provide a formal statement," Mabel said, "which for a regional authority proceeding carries the same weight." Pruitt looked at the grass under his boots. "Frank Aldermore's not going to be able to talk his way out from under that." "No." Pruitt looked at her. Something moved in his expression. The same small shift she'd seen at the fence the morning she'd explained the post damage. A man arriving at a conclusion he was going to stand on. "I knew your father," he said. "Not well. He was a careful man." She hadn't known that. She held herself still and let it land. "He knew this valley," Pruitt said. "I remember thinking, when he died, that the valley had lost someone who actually paid attention to it." He looked back at the grass. "Seems like he left someone behind who does the same." He walked away toward the barn, and the moment closed the way Pruitt moments always did, without ceremony, without anything you could point to as a conclusion, just the absence of what had been there before. Colton was watching her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. It wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for the moment. She spent the following week assembling the complete case file. The original contamination report, the independent inspection confirmation, the expansion permit and its timeline, Frank Aldermore's signed receipt for the inspector's recommendations, Deke's written statement, the cattle weight comparison documentation, and Professor Mears's letter. She organized it in the order that built the clearest argument, not the chronological order of how she'd found things, but the logical order of how a regional authority officer would need to receive them to understand the full picture. She cross-indexed everything. She wrote a cover summary of 4 paragraphs that laid out the situation without drama and pointed to each piece of supporting documentation by reference number. She had Colton review the cattle weight records section to confirm accuracy. She sent a follow-up letter to Professor Mears confirming she'd received his response and asking whether he'd be available for a proceeding in the fall if it came to that, and his reply was a single sentence. He would. When the file was complete, she set it on the desk and sat back and looked at it. It was thick, not impressive in the way of a courthouse drama, nothing theatrical about it, just paper and ink and 8 weeks of patient, daily, unglamorous work. But it was, she believed, sufficient. More than sufficient. It was the kind of documentation that made denial expensive and continued resistance more costly than resolution. She brought the file to Colton on a Wednesday evening and set it on his table. He sat down and went through it slowly, the way he'd read everything she'd brought him, actually reading, following the argument, not just looking for the conclusion. When he finished, he looked up. "You're ready to file this with the regional authority?" "Yes, but I'd recommend sending a copy to Pitts first." Colton looked at her. "You want to give Aldermore's lawyer a look at this before we file?" I want to give Aldermore's lawyer the opportunity to advise his client that the procedural challenge is no longer going to work, she said. If Frank sees this file before it goes to the regional authority, and Pitts is doing his job, Frank will understand that fighting it is going to cost him significantly more than settling it. And if Frank tells Pitts to fight it anyway, then we file and we win, she said. But a settlement that requires remediation achieves the same outcome faster, and faster matters for this operation. Colton sat with that. She watched him think it through, watched him work past the part of himself that wanted the full public accounting. She understood that impulse. She didn't dismiss it, and arrive at the practical question of what actually served the ranch. Send it to Pitts, he said. She sent it Friday. The cover letter was 2 sentences. The enclosed documentation would be filed with the Regional Land Authority on the following Friday, unless the Aldermore family indicated a willingness to enter remediation discussions before that date. There was no threat in the language. The file itself was the only argument it needed. Pitts responded on Tuesday. His letter was professionally neutral, the language of a lawyer who'd looked at something and was managing his client's expectations while managing his own position. The Aldermore family was willing to discuss remediation terms. Could a meeting be arranged at a mutually convenient location? Colton read the letter and set it down and looked at Mabel. He looked at the file, Colton said. Yes. And he told Frank. Yes. And Frank told him to settle. That would be my reading, she said. Colton looked at the ceiling for a moment. When he looked back down, his expression had something in it she hadn't seen before. Not relief exactly, not triumph, something quieter than both. The particular look of a man who'd been holding a great deal of weight and had just felt a portion of it shift off him. The August note, he said. The timber sale covered it, she said. You know that. I know. I just needed to say it out loud. He exhaled. What does a remediation settlement look like? Full remediation of the settling pond at crossbar expense, verified by independent inspection. The same standard I set out in the conditions to Deke. Ongoing water quality monitoring for a minimum of 2 years at their expense, and a formal county record of the agreed resolution so that if the contamination recurs, the baseline is established. She paused. The damage claim is the negotiable piece. You can hold it or release it depending on what they offer in terms of remediation quality and timeline. What would you do? She thought about it honestly. I'd release it in exchange for an accelerated remediation timeline, 60 days instead of 90. Every day that pond is running is another day of contamination, even at reduced levels. Faster remediation is worth more to this ranch than whatever the damage claim would yield after legal fees. He nodded slowly. 60 days. And the independent inspector is non-negotiable, she said. We select, they pay. Agreed. The meeting with Pitts happened the following week, at the county land office with Howard Garrett present as the oversight authority. Frank Aldermore did not come himself. He sent Pitts and a ranch manager, which told Mabel everything she needed to know about how Frank had processed the situation. Not defeated, exactly. A man like Frank Aldermore didn't do defeated cleanly, but absent, which was its own kind of answer. The negotiation took 4 hours. Mabel sat beside Colton and answered technical questions when they arose and said nothing when nothing needed to be said. Pitts was professional and unhappy in equal measure, which was appropriate. The Crossbars ranch manager looked like a man who had been instructed to cooperate and found it genuinely uncomfortable. They settled on 63 days for the remediation timeline. The independent inspector was confirmed by mutual agreement. Mabel had a name ready, a woman named Dr. Frances Hull, who worked out of the State Agricultural Bureau and whose credentials were unimpeachable. The damage claim was released in exchange for the timeline and a water quality monitoring agreement of 30 months. Garrett signed the agreement as the county representative and stamped it, and the thing was done. On the steps outside, Colton stood in the afternoon light looking at the street. He didn't say anything immediately. Mabel stood beside him and let the quiet be what it was. My father bought the original 40 acres of this ranch when he was 29 years old, Colton said. He told me once that land doesn't give you anything for free. You pay for it every year in the same currency, work and attention, and not walking away from it when it's hard. He paused. I think he meant that as a warning, but I always heard it as a promise. Mabel looked at the street. It's both, she said. He looked at her. How are you going to explain this to the town? I'm not going to explain anything to the town, she said. The county record speaks for itself. People can read or they can keep talking. They'll do both regardless. They'll have to make room for you now, he said, whether they want to or not. She thought about the 7 front doors. She thought about Warren Delby's laughter on the main street, the particular quality of it that hadn't bothered to lower its voice. She thought about every measuring silence and every recalibrating expression and every conversation she hadn't been part of that had decided, without consulting her, what she was and wasn't worth. They'll make room for the work, she said. That's enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is it? Actually? The question caught her without a prepared answer, which was unusual. She stood with it for a moment. It is right now, she said finally. Ask me again in a year. He almost smiled. It was the second time she'd seen that. The almost, the thing that was close but held something back. She didn't push it. Some things moved at their own pace and were better for it. They rode back as the light dropped behind the western ridgeline and the valley settled into the amber hour before dark. The grass on either side of the road was tall and moving in the evening wind, and somewhere north of them the cattle were settling for the night in pastures that were cleaner than they'd been in 2 years and getting cleaner. Mabel rode with her notebook under her arm and thought about what she'd write tonight. Not the settlement terms. Those were on record. The other part. The section in the back that wasn't evidence. She'd write about Pruitt saying he'd known her father. She'd write about the moment in the hotel dining room when Deke had said it wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. And she'd felt the truth of that settle in her like a stone finding the bottom of still water. She'd write about the grass in the east pasture, the way recovery looked like nothing dramatic and everything necessary. She'd write it down, and it would exist somewhere, and that was enough for the evening. The remediation work on the crossbar settling pond began on a Tuesday in late June, 41 days after the agreement was signed, which was ahead of the 63-day timeline and surprised everyone except Mabel, who had decided that Frank Aldermore, having lost the argument, would want the evidence of his loss cleaned up as quickly as possible. She didn't say this to anyone. She wrote it in the back section of her notebook, in the part that wasn't evidence, and left it there. Dr. Frances Hull arrived to oversee the first inspection phase on a Thursday morning. A compact woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular directness of someone who had spent decades being the only woman in rooms full of men who thought they knew more than her. She shook Mabel's hand at the ranch gate and said, "You wrote a good report. The mineral signature analysis was clean." And Mabel felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was still held tight. "Thank you," Mabel said. "Don't thank me. It's just accurate." Hull looked at the range spreading out behind the gate. "Show me the south pasture." They walked it together for 2 hours, Hull taking her own samples and making her own notes, asking sharp questions that Mabel answered without hedging. At one point, Hull crouched near the creek bank and looked at the water running through and said, "This will clear completely within 90 days of full remediation, possibly less. The soil's got good recovery capacity." "I thought so," Mabel said. "Based on the pre-contamination records." Hull looked up at her. "You had pre-contamination records?" "I've been keeping records of this valley for 8 years." Hull stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. She looked at Mabel with an expression that had nothing performative in it, just straight assessment, person to person. "Why hasn't anyone given you a formal position before now?" Mabel held her gaze. "You'd have to ask them." Hull made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something harder. "I know the answer," she said. "I just wanted to see if you'd say it." They walked back to the ranch house in the late morning, and Hull took her samples and her notes and drove back toward Harrow Creek, and Mabel stood in the yard for a moment after she left and thought about what Hull had said. Not the question she'd lived inside for years. The part about wanting to see if she'd say it. The deliberate choice to hand her the moment and watch what she did with it. She filed it in the back section that night. The 63 days passed the way days pass when you're watching them, slowly from inside and faster in retrospect. The remediation crew from the crossbar worked the settling pond systematically, and Hull made 3 inspection visits and submitted her interim reports to the county land office, and Garrett sent copies to both parties, And Pitts's responses became progressively shorter and more professionally neutral, in the way of a man who had accepted an outcome and was managing it without enthusiasm. Frank Aldermore was not seen in Red Hollow during this period. His absence was noticed because Red Hollow noticed everything, and the reason for his absence was discussed because Red Hollow discussed everything. And what the town arrived at, slowly, through the particular process of collective revision that happens when a story everyone thought they knew turns out to have a different ending, was a version of events that was not entirely accurate but was directionally correct. The Voss Ranch had found a contamination problem, documented it properly, and the crossbar had been required to fix it. What the town was still working out was Mabel's role in it. She knew this because Clara, her aunt, who had remained in the house on the east side of town while Mabel lived at the ranch, reported it with the faithful accuracy of someone who had been listening at the edges of public conversation for decades. "They don't know what to do with you," Clara said. She'd come out to the ranch on a Sunday, something she hadn't done before, and they sat on the porch of the small foreman's house in the afternoon heat with cold water and the particular ease of two women who'd learned each other's silences. They keep trying to tell the story in a way that makes sense to them. "What version are they landing on?" Mabel asked. "Right now, the most popular one is that you helped Colton Voss find a water problem, and he handled the rest." Clara paused. "I've been correcting that version when I hear it." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Clara said. "I do it because it's accurate. And because I'm 71 years old and I'm tired of watching people tell inaccurate stories about women who do the work while men get the credit." She said it without heat, the way she said most things, as plain fact delivered by someone who'd had enough time to be done being surprised by it. Mabel looked at the range. The south pasture was visible from the porch, and the grass was visibly fuller than it had been 2 months ago. Not complete. Completion would take another full season. But unmistakably, undeniably better. She had looked at it every evening and written the date and a one-line observation in her notebook. She had 41 consecutive entries now. "How's Warren Delby taking it?" Mabel asked. Claire's expression did something complicated. "Quiet," she said, which from Warren is about as close to embarrassed as he gets. Mabel nodded. She'd thought about Warren less than she expected to over these months. He'd taken up a lot of space in her thinking during the years when what he'd done still felt like a verdict rather than an opinion. The distance between those two things was something she'd had to earn, and she hadn't fully arrived at it until sometime in the middle of the contamination documentation work, when she'd been alone in the office at 11 at night reading survey records by lamplight, and had suddenly realized she hadn't thought about any of the 7 doors in 3 weeks. "Let him be quiet," Mabel said. "That's enough from him." Clara looked at her with something in her eyes that wasn't quite pride, something more like recognition. The look of someone who had been watching for a long time and was glad of what they were finally seeing. August arrived, and the note came due, and Colton paid it, and the timber section sale covered it without touching the operating funds. And the day after he made the payment, he came to the foreman's house and knocked on the door. And when Mabel opened it, he said, "I want to show you something." She followed him out to the south pasture. He walked her to the section that had been the worst of it, the area directly downstream from the contamination source, where the grass had been thinnest and the soil heaviest with the mineral buildup. And he stopped and looked at it. The grass was back, not fully, not uniformly, but it was back in a way that changed the look of the land. The color was different. The density was different. If you put your hand down in it, you felt the living resistance of growth rather than the dry brittleness of suppressed soil. Colton stood there with his hat in his hands and said nothing. Mabel stood beside him and said nothing either, and this was one of those silences that had accumulated between them over months into something that had weight and texture of its own. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just the particular quiet of two people who had been through something together and had arrived at a place where words were a second-best option. After a while, he said, "I called in the August numbers this morning. The herd weight in the south section is up 14% from the spring assessment." "Consistent with the contamination timeline, it's," Mabel said. "You should see another 8 to 10% by October if the grass recovery continues at the current rate. You've already calculated it. Last week, it's in the monthly report." He looked at her. "Have you read the monthly report yourself recently, the whole thing?" "I wrote the monthly report." I know, but have you read it as a document rather than as something you were producing? She wasn't sure what he meant, and her expression must have said so, because he continued. There's a ranch in this valley, he said, that 3 months ago was looking at a collapsed south pasture, contaminated water, failing cattle numbers, a note it couldn't make, and 2 senior hands who were considering walking. Today it has a recovering south pasture, clean water with documentation to keep it that way, cattle numbers going in the right direction, a note that's been paid, and 30 men who show up every morning and do their work. He paused. I know how that happened, but when you read the monthly report, do you see that? She was quiet for a moment. I see the numbers. That's not the same thing, he said, and his voice had something in it that she didn't often hear. Not soft exactly, but careful. The voice of a man placing something down carefully because it was fragile or valuable or both. She looked at the grass. She thought about the 8 years of notebooks, the 7 front doors, the afternoon she'd packed her notebook and walked 4 miles without being sure of her reception. She thought about the bench outside the main house, the cup of coffee pushed across the table, the key that had sat on the desk looking not entirely real. I see it, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. He put his hat back on. Good, he said, and that was all. And they walked back to the ranch together through the evening that was coming in gold and long across the valley. What happened in Red Hollow in the weeks after the remediation was completed was not a dramatic reversal. Life in a small territory town doesn't reverse dramatically. It shifts, slowly, the way creek beds shift, through accumulated small changes that one day add up to a different landscape. People didn't suddenly declare themselves wrong about Mabel Hartley. They didn't gather in the street and make speeches. They did smaller things that added up to the same meaning. The dry goods counterwoman, a woman named Ruth Elkins, who had been present for Warren Delby's performance outside her store years ago and had laughed along with everyone else, stopped Mabel one morning and asked her opinion on a drainage problem in the east section of her husband's property. She asked it quietly, without preamble, and Mabel gave her a practical answer without making anything of the ask, and Ruth nodded and said thank you, and that was that. But she'd asked. She'd decided it was worth asking. The feed store owner, Marcus Webb, began setting aside the agricultural pamphlets that came through his supply orders and holding them for Mabel because he'd heard she collected them. He didn't make a production of it. He just had them ready when she came in, stacked on the corner of the counter. The man from the livery stable nodded at her on the street. A full, deliberate nod, the kind that meant something in a town where the gradations of acknowledgement carried social weight. None of these things were large. Individually, they were barely visible. Together, they were the texture of a change that was real and would hold, because it had come from observation rather than declaration. These people had updated what they thought, because they'd seen something that required updating, and that kind of revision doesn't reverse. Mabel wrote about this in the back section too, not bitterly. She'd moved past the place where bitterness would have been useful, but honestly. She wrote that being seen for what you are after years of being seen for what you look like is not a simple, uncomplicated relief. It carries its own weight. There's grief in it for the years when the scene came too late or not at all. And there's the complicated work of receiving something you wanted for so long that you'd built defenses against wanting it. She wrote, "The problem with getting what you needed is that it makes you fully aware of how long you went without it." She closed the notebook and went back to work. The gray gelding, whose name turned out to be a matter of some dispute among the hands, 3 of them had given him different names in the months he'd been unmanageable, none of which had stuck because none of them had been speaking to a horse that was listening, finally accepted a name in September. It was Mabel who named him, which no one made a ceremony of, but which everyone noticed. She called him Current, because he'd been moving against something unseen from the beginning and had come through it. Pruitt said, when he heard the name, "That makes sense," which was the closest thing to poetry she'd heard from him, and she thought her father would have liked the man. The thought of her father came more often now than it had in the years right after his death, which she'd been told was common and had not found to be true in her experience until recently. She thought about what he would have made of these months. He was a man who'd taken everything seriously and nothing personally, which was a harder combination than it sounded, and she thought he would have recognized in this valley's problems the same kind of patient, Systemic attention he'd given everything. He would have recognized her notebooks. He might have said something dry and accurate about the 7 front doors that would have made her laugh. She would have told him about Pruitt saying he'd known him. She thought he would have been glad to be remembered that way. Not as a legend, just as a careful man who'd paid attention. She was thinking about this on the first cool morning of September, when Colton found her at the desk in the bunkhouse office with the window open and the early air coming through it and the notebook spread in front of her in the particular organized chaos that was her working arrangement. He sat down in the opposite chair, something he'd been doing more frequently over the past weeks, the habit of a man who'd found a place where thinking happened and had started to come to it. Hull filed her final inspection report yesterday, he said. I know. Garrett sent me a copy. The remediation is certified complete. Yes. 30 months of water quality monitoring starts from yesterday's date. Yes? He looked at her. What's next? She'd known this question was coming. She'd been carrying it around since July, turning it over, looking at its different faces. That depends, she said. On what? On what you're asking. She held his gaze. If you're asking what's next for the ranch, I have a full assessment of the winter grazing rotation that accounts for the south section's recovery trajectory, and I can walk you through it this afternoon. If you're asking something else, I'd rather you ask it directly. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was working near the barn, the sound of metal on wood, rhythmic and distant. I'd like you to stay on, he said, not as a temporary arrangement, as a permanent position, formal title, formal wage. Land and water manager for the Voss operation. She'd expected this and had still not entirely prepared for receiving it. She kept her expression level. What does that look like in terms of scope? Full authority over grazing management, water system maintenance, soil assessment, and documentation. You'd have direct input on any expansion or acquisition decisions that involve land quality. He paused. Pruitt would handle the cattle and hands management. You'd have equal standing with him in operational decisions. Pruitt knows this? I talked to him last week. He said, and I'm giving you his exact words, that woman knows more about this land than I do, and it'd be stupid not to use it. Mabel thought about Pruitt's face saying those words. It was absolutely accurate. I have conditions, she said. I expected you would. The title needs to be in writing in the county employment record. Not just internal. Public record. If I'm doing this work at the level it requires, it needs to be documented as a professional position, not something informal that can be characterized differently later. Agreed. My notebook records, 8 years of them, become working documents of the operation, not personal property I take when I leave. In exchange, the operation compensates me for the historical value of that documentation. He looked at her carefully. What's your figure? She told him. It was a fair number, not inflated, based on the actual cost of 8 years of materials and the documented benefit of having that data available. The contamination case alone had been built partly on that historical record. He didn't flinch. Agreed. Third. She stopped. This was the one she'd thought about longest. I need a decision-making role on water rights negotiations. This valley's water situation is going to become contested within 5 years. The population's growing in the northern territories, and the downstream pressure on this watershed will increase. I need to be part of those conversations from the beginning, not brought in after decisions are made. Colton looked at her for a long moment. That's not a land manager request, that's a partner request. Yes, she said. The word sat between them with everything it carried. She had thought, in the weeks leading up to this moment, about what she was actually asking for, and what she was not asking for, and about the difference. She was not asking for something she hadn't earned. She was not asking out of the exhaustion of wanting to be wanted, the way she'd been wanted, or not wanted, by 7 men who looked at her and saw something less than what was there. She was asking from the position of someone who knew exactly what she'd contributed and what it was worth, and was done accepting less than that worth in the accounting. Yes, Colton said. Yes to the role, or yes that it's a partner request. Both, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. There was something in the room that had been building since the first morning she'd spread her notes on his breakfast table, and he'd actually read them. And it was not a simple thing, and she was not going to pretend it was simple or rush it into a shape it wasn't ready for. But it was there. It had been there for some time, patient and solid, the way the things that actually last tend to be. Then we should put the whole arrangement in writing, she said. This week, he said. Good. She turned back to her notebooks, and he stayed in the chair, and neither of them felt the need to make anything larger of the moment than it was, because what it was already felt sufficient. The arrangement went into writing that Friday at the county land office, with Garrett officiating because he'd become something of an unofficial witness to the whole arc of this situation and seemed to find a dry satisfaction in seeing it reach this point. He read the documents, asked 2 clarifying questions, and signed where required. Miss Hartley, he said when the papers were filed. That report you brought me in April. Yes? I've been in this office for 19 years, he said. That was one of the 5 best documented cases I've received in that time. He paused. I should have said so earlier. She looked at him. Yes, she said. You should have. He had the grace to receive that without deflecting. Noted, he said. They left the office and stood on the steps in the October light, which was thinner now, the summer burned off and the cooler season settling in with its particular clarity. Garrett just admitted he should have said something sooner, Colton said. Yes. That's not nothing from Garrett. No, she agreed. It's not. He looked at the street. Red Hollow was going about its Tuesday in the way it always did. The dry goods wagon at the corner, 2 women talking outside the post office, a dog sleeping in the wedge of sun near the livery. Ordinary, unchanged, exactly itself. She'd spent years in this town being seen as the wrong shape for whatever it needed. She'd walked its streets with the particular weight of being publicly assessed and publicly found wanting. She knew every face on it, every gradation of how those faces arranged themselves when they looked at her. Standing on those steps in October, she felt the town differently. Not transformed, she'd never been the kind of person who believed in transformation as a single event, a before and after. But different. The way you feel different standing in a room you've been in many times when the light is coming from a new angle. Same room, different quality of seeing. Warren Delby crossed the street below them. He saw her. He did not laugh. He did not look away either, which would have been its own kind of statement. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man performing a recalculation he hadn't asked for and wasn't finished with. And then he nodded and kept walking. She watched him go. Was that? Colton began. Yes, she said. Did he just... Yes. Colton was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly. Like it's the smallest possible thing he could do, she said, and also like it's something. They rode home in the early afternoon, and the valley opened up around them in the way it always did from the road north of town. The ridge lines on both sides, the grass running long in the fields that were transitioning from summer growth to fall color, the creek visible in the lower section catching the flat light. This valley. Her father's valley. Hers in the only way she'd ever wanted to hold it. Through knowledge, through attention, through the daily work of understanding what was here. In October, Dr. Francis Hull sent a letter to Mabel at the ranch. It was professional in format and direct in content. She was assembling a working group on watershed contamination documentation in grazing territories to produce a standard reference guide for land managers in the region. She had read Mabel's contamination report and the follow-up documentation. She would like Mabel to contribute a chapter on field methodology and soil sample analysis specific to valley watershed systems. She enclosed a schedule and a fee for the contribution. Mabel read the letter twice. She read the fee, which was more than she'd expected. She set it on the desk and looked at it. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back, accepting. She told Colton about it at supper that evening. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're going to be published." "A contributed chapter in a working reference guide," she said. "It's not a novel." "In 10 years," he said, "that chapter is going to be cited by land managers across 3 states who don't know your name and are using your methodology without knowing whose it is." She looked at him. "That's a specific prediction." "I've been watching you work for 6 months," he said. "I'm starting to know what your work produces." She thought about that for the rest of the evening. The idea of work going forward without you, past your name, into the hands of people who just need it because it's useful. Her father had worked this land for 20 years and left no publications, no formal record, just the land itself in the shape of how he'd managed it, and the memory in an older ranch hand who'd mentioned him at a fence post on an autumn morning. That was a kind of publication, too. That was the kind that didn't need a title page. She wrote the chapter over 6 weeks, working in the evenings after the daily ranch work was finished. She wrote it in the same plain, precise language she'd used for the contamination report, the kind of writing that's harder than it looks because it requires removing everything unnecessary and being left with what's actually true. Hull's editorial response came back with 2 small corrections and 1 note that said, "Excellent methodology section, clearest I've received." The working group published the reference guide in the spring. Mabel's chapter occupied pages 43 through 61. Her name was in the contributors section as Mabel Hartley, Voss Land Operations, Red Hollow Territory, and her title was listed as Land and Water Manager because that was what was in the county record, because she'd made sure of it. Winter on the ranch was a different kind of work. Less about crisis and more about maintenance, about checking and preparing and keeping the systems that had been established in summer running through the harder season. Mabel had always found winter clarifying. The valley showed itself differently in cold, the water systems more visible, the soil conditions more readable, the animal behavior more legible without the confusion of heat and heavy growth. She and Pruitt developed, over the winter months, the working relationship she'd hoped for from the beginning. Not warm in any demonstrative sense, because neither of them was built that way, but solid and functional in the way of 2 people who respect each other's competence and have stopped needing to establish it. He deferred to her on water and land questions without ceremony. She deferred to him on cattle management and hand relations without ceremony. They had 2 disagreements that winter, both of which they resolved by laying out their respective evidence and letting the evidence settle it, and both of which ended without residue. The gray gelding, Current, wintered well. He'd become something that the hands worked with routinely by December, which had seemed impossible in April. Mabel didn't take particular credit for this. She'd simply given him the conditions under which what he already was could function. Most of the good work she'd done in this period felt like that, not imposing something new, but removing what was blocking what was already there. She wrote that in the back section of the notebook, on a night in January when the wind was up and the lamp was warm and she was thinking about the year that had passed. She wrote, "I spent years believing the problem was what I looked like. The real problem was that I was in the wrong room. Not because the room was right and I was wrong for it, but because the room had decided in advance what it needed and couldn't update. The door opened when I found a room that had a problem I could actually solve. After that, it wasn't about what I looked like. It was about what I could do. I don't know if that's justice. I think it's just how things work, and the work is understanding that and going to find the right room anyway." She read it back. Then she added, "The notebooks were always the right room. I'd had it the whole time." Spring came back to the valley with the particular extravagance of a season following a hard one. The South Pasture, in its 2nd year of clean water and recovery, came in thick and even. And when Hull made her first monitoring inspection of the year, she walked the section and made her notes, and at the end said to Mabel, "Full recovery. I'd certify this pasture as restored." Mabel wrote the date and the word restored in her notebook. 43 characters. The end of a 2-year entry. At the spring cattle assessment, the South section herd numbers were the best in the ranch's recorded history. Pruitt presented the numbers at the morning meeting without preamble, read them out, and looked up and said, "That's because of the pasture restoration." And then he looked at Mabel and said, "Your work," and went back to his notes. Colton, across the table, said nothing, but she caught his expression for a moment before he moved on to the next item, and what was in it was something she'd been learning to receive without deflecting. The particular look of someone who had made a good decision and knew it, and was glad. She thought about the woman who had walked to this ranch a year ago with a worn notebook and an idea about creek diversion. She thought about sitting on the bench outside the main house, hands flat on the notebook, waiting. She thought about how much of what had happened since then had come from that particular kind of willingness. Not confidence, not certainty, just the refusal to let fear make the decision about whether to try. She had been rejected 7 times. She had spent years carrying that as evidence of something wrong with her. She understood now, with the full clarity that only time and honest work can bring, that what those 7 doors had measured was not her worth, but their own limitations. She was not too large for this world. She was too large for those particular rooms, and that was a different thing entirely, and it was their loss, not hers. That was not a comfortable thought. It carried grief as well as resolution. Grief for the years that had passed in the waiting, for the version of herself that had spent too long accepting other people's assessments as verdicts. She didn't tidy that grief into something neat. She let it exist alongside everything else, because that was honest, and honesty had been the only tool that had ever actually worked. What she knew, standing in the valley in spring with the grass coming back and the water running clean, and 30 men showing up every morning to work land that was healthier than it had been in years, was this. She had always been exactly what she was. The documentation had been in the notebooks the whole time. The world had simply needed to be presented with it in a format it couldn't dismiss. The county agricultural fair in May included, for the first time in its 30-year history, a session on watershed management for small and medium ranching operations. The organizer had written to Mabel in February asking if she would speak. She had said yes. She stood at the front of a room of 40 people, ranchers, land managers, a few county officials, and in the back row, Clara, who had made the trip to Harrow Creek without announcing she was coming and sat with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who was feeling a great deal and had decided not to make a scene about it. Mabel spoke for 40 minutes about watershed documentation, about the specific behavior of this valley's water systems, about how the contamination case had been built and what methodologies had been most useful. She spoke without notes because she'd lived inside the material long enough that notes would only have slowed her down. She answered questions for 20 minutes after. 2 of the ranchers in the audience had questions that showed they'd been dealing with similar problems on their own properties and hadn't known how to approach them. She gave them both her address at the Voss Ranch and told them to write. Afterward, Clara came to the front of the room and stood in front of her daughter's daughter and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Your mother would have been here." It was the first time Clara had mentioned Mabel's mother in years. They'd both, by mutual and unspoken agreement, stopped bringing up the people they'd lost because the bringing up had for a long time felt like more weight than comfort. Mabel felt it land differently now. "I know," she said. "She always said you were the most stubborn person she'd ever met," Claire said. She meant it as the highest compliment. Mabel thought about her mother, who had been round and quiet and had worked their small household with the steady competence of someone who'd never been given enough room and had made enough out of what she had anyway. She thought about what it would mean to her mother to see this room, this afternoon, these 40 people who had come to learn something from her daughter. She thought it would have mattered enormously, and she thought her mother would have made very little visible show of it, which was exactly right. "Tell me I'm not too late," said a voice from the doorway, and Mabel looked up to see Deke Aldermore standing there with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who'd driven some distance to arrive somewhere he wasn't sure of his welcome. She looked at him for a moment. "You're late for the session," she said. "You're not too late for the conversation." He came in. He sat in the back near the door, not next to Clara, but close enough that Clara nodded at him, which Clara did for anyone who came in good faith, and Deke Aldermore had earned by the thing he'd done at considerable personal cost. They talked for another hour, the 3 of them and 2 of the ranchers who'd lingered with questions. And what they talked about was practical. Water rights documentation, the monitoring process, what the county land office needed to see to act, how to build a case that couldn't be dismissed. She gave away everything she knew, because everything she knew was more useful moving around the valley than sitting in her notebooks, and she'd understood since February that the value of knowledge isn't in the holding of it. Deke, when the others had gone, said quietly, "Frank's selling the north section of the crossbar." She'd heard this. To whom? "A family from outside the territory. They're coming in clean, no history here." He looked at his hat. "Frank's staying on with what's left, but he's not—" He stopped. It's smaller now. Mabel nodded. She understood what Deke was not quite saying, that the consequence of what Frank had done was not ruin, but reduction, and that reduction was perhaps the more appropriate consequence. Not dramatic, just the correct sizing of what he had to what he'd earned. "And you?" she said. "I'm keeping the north section running," Deke said. "I offered to buy out Frank's remaining share, but he's not ready." He paused. "Maybe next year." "The monitoring inspector will be on your land twice a year for the next 2.5 years, she said. "I know." He met her eyes. "I'll make sure she has full access." She believed him, not because she was inclined to trust easily, she wasn't, not anymore, but because Deke Aldermore had shown her what he was made of in a hotel dining room in Harrow Creek, and it had held. "Good," she said. He left, and Clara left shortly after, and Mabel walked out of the fairground building into the May afternoon alone and stood in the light for a moment. Colton was waiting by the horses. He hadn't come in. He'd said the night before that it was her session and he'd only be in the way, which was both tactful and accurate, and she'd appreciated both things about it. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. 2 ranchers with contamination problems they didn't know how to document. Deke Aldermore came. I saw him arrive. He looked at her. "Are you tired?" She considered. "Not the way I used to be tired," she said. "The old tired was from pushing against something that wasn't moving. This is just use." He nodded slowly. He understood the distinction. She could see that he did. They rode home through the valley in the late afternoon, and the light was doing what it did in this season. Long and generous, the kind that makes the land look like it's giving something back. And the grass on both sides of the road was full and green and moving in the easy wind, and the creek she could see in the lower section was running clear and steady as it had not run for some years. She had 8 years of notebooks in a locked case in the foreman's house. She had a 9th notebook started, the current one, which had 53 pages of operational records and 48 pages in the back section that were not for the operation and not for anyone but her. She had a formal title in the county employment record. She had a chapter in a reference guide that would go out to land managers across the region. She had the gray gelding who had decided she was not a problem. She had Pruitt's version of respect, and Clara's version of pride, and Hull's version of professional recognition, and Deke Aldermore's version of gratitude, and Colton Voss's version of something she was not in a hurry to name. She had this valley, which she had always had, which had always been the thing that mattered most. She thought about the woman who had sat on a bench outside a stranger's house and waited, hands flat on a worn notebook, not knowing what the door would do. She thought about what she would say to that woman, if she could. She would not say it gets easier because that wasn't exactly true. It gets different, and different requires its own kind of effort. She would not say, "You'll be proven right," because being right was never the point, and anyone who made it the point would lose the actual thing. She would say, "Keep the notebook. Keep writing down what you see. The facts don't require anyone's permission to be true. The creek doesn't ask for approval before it runs clean. The grass doesn't wait for consensus before it grows back. You don't either." She rode home into the evening with the valley around her and the notebook under her arm, and the south pasture came into view as they crested the last low rise before the ranch gate, full and green and restored, and hers in the way that only honest work can make something yours. And she looked at it for a long moment and then looked forward again and rode on. There are people in this world who get told early what they're worth and spend their lives trying to argue with that number. Mabel Hartley had been one of those people for a long time. What she learned, through years and notebooks and 7 closed doors and one that finally opened, was that the argument was always a mistake. You don't argue with people who've decided not to see you. You go find the land that needs what you know, and you do the work, and the work makes its own case better than any argument ever could. She had not been waiting for someone to believe in her. She had been waiting for a problem worthy of what she already was. When she found it, she didn't hesitate. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. And the valley knew it. And that was the truest record she had ever kept.